snowball one. All right, so the first step in any one of our projects is we go to the P drive, we go to 2510, and we copy our template, right? So make a copy of that, and then inside here, if we have any reference images, we drop our reference images into that folder. There's nothing else inside here except for our, I have a title scene, but you won't have anything in there. Okay, now we're going to set this up in a way that allows us to basically create one scene, do all of our render settings first, and then build everything on top of it. And the purpose for that is sometimes you may want a specific look that is continuous throughout many animations that you do. And it's a very specific-ish kind of style that's to Cinema 4D rendering. Of course not when I want to show it. Yeah, we'll say it's similar to this, right? So in the background, we have basically just a gradated background. In this case, they have a floor right here that has some texture, but it basically has some shadow as well. And you'll see these kinds of very similar looks like this, and like this, and like this, where they're all kind of a very similar kind of style slash look to them, okay? So we're going to set up Cinema first to be ready to go with that, okay? So I'm going to make just a random shape. So spheres work perfect. And for this, we're going to have text. The text will obviously be bigger than the sphere, but I'm just using the sphere right now just so I can drop in some textures and some lights and then build everything off of that, okay? I'm going to go here to floor. And this is one of the cool things about Cinema. Some softwares do not have this, where if I render the floor, it actually is an infinite floor. So even though it's small, it actually goes on forever, okay? Which is really nice because if I were to just create a plane and render that out, it looks like a plane, okay? No matter which angle I shoot it from, it looks like a plane. I would have to scale this up huge in order for it to not look like just a plane, and then that's, you know, we don't have to do that. So we just create a floor, and you have a floor forever. We're also going to make a background. So under that same area that floor is, there's also a background. And what the background is going to do is it's going to be just like the floor is. It's going to be whatever our camera is facing, the back of it, that's what it'll look like. Okay, so right now if I render, you see it's blue. Before it was black. Okay, like that. So now I'm going to start adding some materials to these so that they make a little bit more sense. So I'm going to double click here, and I'm going to assign a color to this. I don't want any reflectance in this case at the moment. And on the color, I'm going to click the arrow and I'm going to add in a gradient. Now I want to create, so you can see it here. It's like darker around these edges, like that. That's what I want to create. I want to create basically like a live vignette so that when I render, we always have this vignette happening. So that's what I'm going to create with this gradient. So I click on that. This would give me basically a black on the left side, white on the right side. That's not what I want. If I go to V, black's on the bottom, white's on the top. Could be a good effect for some things. Actually, the one image here, nope. Where do I see it? Like this one. This one might have that black on the top, white on the bottom, and then black on this area here. They might have that kind of gradient going with this one. It all depends on what your end look is, okay? So for this, I'm going to go down to circular. These are all different ways that it can calculate what a gradient is. Photoshop and Illustrator have like two ways, right? Linear and radial. This one has like, here's box, here is cylindrical, here is spherical. Okay, we want circular. All right. I'm going to make these pretty drastic colors just for now so we can see it. So bright blue, and then bright orange. Okay, again, drastic colors just so we can see it. We will tweak the colors after. So I'm going to drop this onto my background, and also drop this onto my floor. When I render it, that's what I get. Okay, not what I wanted. We will fix it. I need the floor here to not be projected flat. I want it to be projected frontal. So when I click on either of these, that's where I get those options. So I click on frontal. Same thing with this one. Click on frontal. Now, what frontal means is my camera is shooting this way. It's going to project it straight from the camera. That's the frontal area. Okay, so if my camera rotates like this, it's still projecting it straight down. Wherever my camera moves, that plane stays projected perfect, which is a nice feature with this. Okay, so now we have this blue right in the center and this orange on the outside. Why is my floor not showing up? That's a good question. Why aren't you showing up, floor? Oops, it was the angle. We couldn't see it was the angle. Cool. So there's that. I don't want to have a line between the two items. I basically just want to use my floor as a way to cast shadows onto it. Okay? So imagine that I have just a no color at all, just whatever the background is, that's the color of my floor, and I just have whatever my object is, shadows are cast on top of it. Okay? So I'm going to add a light, because I'll need a light to cast shadows, so I'll make an area light. For most of your stuff that looks professional, you want to use area lights. They emulate pretty close to real-world lights. If I had something like a light bulb I'm trying to create, I would probably use regular light. If it's a spotlight, I would probably use a spotlight. But for most of our real-world lights, like these fluorescent lights, I would use that. For a computer screen, I would use an area light. Okay? So I'm just going to drop in a basic light here. I'll adjust my lighting as I go. I'm going to go to my shadow area and turn on area light shadows. The difference between the different formulas for how it's calculating the light is if you have a spotlight or you have a regular light, it's coming from a dot. And that's not how real lights work. Lights come from a source. There's actually like an area that it projects from. But because the spotlight and the regular light don't have this area, you have to tell it if you want soft or hard shadows. And then it depends on what your settings are as to what those shadows will look like. An area light takes all the sizing and shaping of this box into account. So there's a very few settings that we can play with, but it'll give us much more accurate shadows because our light is coming from a source. Okay, so we'll see how we can adjust this. I'm going to render this again. And now we have a nice shadow coming off the ball. All right, so now let's get rid of this black line here. I basically need to tell Cinema that this background is a composite image, and basically means I don't want to see the actual floor, I just want to see like the background of it. So I'm going to go to my tags, I'm going to go to Cinema, and I'm going to go to compositing. And in here I'm going to say I don't want the background to cast, or the ground to cast shadows, and I want to use this as a compositing background. Okay, so what that'll do is my ground previously was casting a shadow on the backdrop, okay, or any object that was underneath it. I don't want that. So I got rid of that. And then I told it to be a compositing background, so now it should be basically transparent, where only the shadows will affect it. So now if I kind of line this up, I render it. That didn't work. Why didn't you work? Compositing background, yes. That's on. Oops, it's on the background. I meant to drop this on the floor. That was my fault, not yours. There we go. Beautiful. Okay, so now we have basically this coloration, and then we have our ball sitting on this infinite ground, but it looks like it's all part of one stream, one area here. If you look at any product photography that they do, this is exactly what they're trying to emulate. There we go. Okay, so this is the typical setup here. Is they have these boxes. They're taking, come on. All right, they're taking photos of the item in here. And I don't know if this shows any pictures. You know, let's just cut out. But then they're able to get this kind of stuff. Okay, stuff like that. Or stuff like this. Okay.
Why do that when you could just use some animated thing?
What do you mean?
Like Cinema. Why do that?
Oh, why take a picture? That's a good question. It all depends on your budget and how realistic and your artists. Some places, they do photography in the studio just to get some base images. They'll bring that into cinema and use that to build all of these things. One of our assignments will be to build products and render them out, because that's a huge market. And if you look at any car brochures, you'll see they're all CG. It's all like a 3D model of that car interior that they've rendered out. This process for setting up your cameras and doing all of that to get a nice shot takes forever, like a whole day's worth of shooting. In cinema, it's pretty quick, but we have to worry about things like render time, and we have to worry about getting the actual model that looks realistic. But if we go through an entire day and set it all up, and then we realize that our label has changed, we update one file, everything else is good. We re-render it, and we're all set, okay? So more companies are going towards doing everything digitally, but there still is that market for this because some people just don't have the resources to do everything digitally. Some things, let's see. Some things are a little bit more difficult to do in CG. That's all CG stuff, all CG stuff. All right, I'm not saying anything specific here, but there's a lot of things that are more difficult to do, right? So, not in this case, but maybe they are. Yeah, those look like actual shoes. So these shoes that are here, all the patterns and designs, the intricacies of all the meshing and weaving and stuff, all of that takes a lot of time to do. If I only had one day and I had a photographer on staff, here you go, give me some shots, I need to send them out. Versus I need to actually build a model for each one of these shoes because they're all different, and then texturize them, and then bring them into cinema. The good thing about the auto industry, when they take all their cars, they already have 3D models of these cars. So they'll pipeline them, they'll send them off to the modelers or to the renderers, and that's pretty much their job, is just to take these car models, clean them up a bit, and then render out these nice animations with them. That's a good question. Cool. So there's that. So that's our setup. So now all I need to do is fix those background colors because those are pretty hideous. And if I double click this and give this a name, background matte. Okay, and let's pick better colors. So we go here. You can go with a specific color theme if you want, but I wouldn't recommend going like too crazy with it. Just kind of like pick a color that's horrible meshed together. It's better. And you can also play around with whether you want the dark on the edges or if you want the dark in the center. Okay, so some people will have this for a specific effect. I prefer the other way. I prefer it the other way. It makes more physical sense to me to have it like this, where it's bright in the center and darker on the edges. Just control how much darkness you have. You don't want it to be like black around the edges and bright in the middle. Especially for this, these are supposed to be like fun little text animations. If we go too dark, then it's getting a little bit too serious with our colors, okay? You'll be doing 3 different text animations using 3 different ways that we're animating it. I'll show you several different ways, and you can kind of pick from that. You can watch tutorials, find other stuff online, play around with the tools, get different ideas for how you want to do it. But we're just going to go like, you know, the idea here is fun text animations. So for one of my text animations, I may go with this color theme. For another one of mine, I may just jump this number instead of it being 39. I'm going to put this to, let's say, 214. And then I'll just go to the other one and put this to 214. And so I may have one animation that looks like this and another one that looks like that. And what's cool about doing those kinds of things is that as you're creating these pieces of text and you're putting them in your portfolio, your demo reel, it just gives it like a nice burst of color, okay? Especially for how vibrant that is. I may knock that blue down just a bit. It's a bit dark, or a bit bright. There you go, that's better. Okay? Alright, so now I need to just set up one more light in my scene. My initial shadow of just 1, it's too harsh. I want this, again, fun, so it should be more vibrant, softer shadows. There could be some crispness to it, but I don't want them to be like crazy harsh. And if you look at any of the stuff that you saw in the product photography, typically they have several lights that they're using for the entire scene. So I'm going to light it up like this, but one on each side. And one of these will be casting light or casting shadows. The other one will not be. Okay? And the reason for that, I just don't want to have like competing shadows. Especially when we have an animation. That means that the objects are animated and then the shadows are animated on top of that. So it looks like it's like too distracting. They can't do that in the real world. In 3D we can, which is awesome. Okay, so now we have the ball lit up from both sides. The shadow's a lot softer. We really can start tweaking some of our other stuff, adding text in there and whatnot. Let's say that I needed my shadows to be adjusted further. Okay, the size of the lights are going to control how soft the shadows are. If the light is this big, it's going to have a very tight shadow, very dark shadow. If the light is huge, it will soften the edges of the shadow, but kind of keep a core to it that's a little bit darker. Okay, and just so you can see that, I'm going to bring this in. I'm going to turn off my other light. Okay, so now I have a very crisp light, or I should have a crisp light. I'll render this out. You can see how crisp that shadow is, and you can see right here on the edges it's a little bit soft. On that light, I'll go back to it. Where are you at? There it is. I'm going to make this rectangle huge. Okay, I haven't changed anything else, just the size of the rectangle. And now you'll see I have a dark core here, and then it's softer, kind of going out away from it. Okay? So if your shadows aren't turning out the way you want, size is one thing that you can play with to get them to be a more appropriate size. Also, we have intensity. Even though it says 100, I can crank this up further if I need it to be brighter. Sometimes you may want it to pop a little bit, or sometimes the light just is too far away for it to be bright. Details, area, shape, yes. I do want this to be, I'm going to try this out. Inverse square. Make this bigger. There we go. And you'll see that this got really dark. And so what this inverse square is doing is giving us more of a realistic light. Light doesn't travel forever. Light drops off, right? If I have a flashlight here, it's brighter here than it would be 50 feet away. Okay? So the inverse square simulates it. So by going to details and turning that on, it simulates it. But then I have to crank this intensity up to compensate for it. Oop, that's too much. There we go. I'm going to turn on my other light. Turn this down some more. There we go. So that seems like good starter light. I'll adjust it further later once I get actual text in there, once I get an actual piece of material on it, but that should be sufficient for where we're at. Alright, so I'm going to delete the sphere. I'm done with it. I'm going to save this as my title, startup render setup. Okay, so this is title startup render setup. So everything is all set up with this. If I do title 2, I could do it right in the same file. Everything's still set up. Or I could bring in, open this file and then add some different stuff to it if I want. Okay. So I'm going to create a piece of text. There's a couple spots under create spline. There's a text here. Okay. This is not the way we're going to do it, but just so you can see it. This one under create spline is basically like if you were an illustrator and you typed out a piece of text and you created it as outlines. That's what we would get. These are just curves. We can change what the text says. There it is. Oops. We can change the fonts. We can change the boldness, the alignment, all the same stuff that you would change, you know, in any program. It doesn't have things like kerning as a setting right there. We have to open up this kerning area, and then we'll get things like kerning, tracking, horizontal scale, vertical scale. I typically will just use this. Okay. Now this might look confusing, but what it allows me to do is grab the individual letters and adjust their spacing individually. So I'm just kind of moving the A so that it lines up. What you don't want to have is in some fonts, the spacing in it isn't even. So even though it says Maka, this actually reads Ma-ka, right? Because it's like, it looks like two separate words. So I want to make sure that these are close enough to each other that they feel like they're all part of that same word, okay? And what I do is I look at the spacing between the letters here, between these, and then between that. So I can probably scoot this one back a little bit further if I needed to. There we go. Okay? So there's a piece of text. Now, in the past, if we created a curve, there's a couple things we can do to make that curve an object, okay? Curves don't render. That's what it looks like right now. If I go to this one, and I go to extrude, I can drop my text into the extrude, and now I'll create geometry. And now this would actually render. Okay? I'm going to turn on my display, turn on my shading lines, and then we'll look at a couple settings here. So we have this extrude, and this has subdivisions. Okay? That's what these are adjusting, are the subdivisions right here. We also have ISO subdivisions. This in this case isn't going to adjust anything. We also have caps. So I could do a fillet cap. A fillet cap. I can take the steps up. Take the steps up. Okay? So that's a pretty straightforward, here's how that adjusts. If I wanted to adjust, some of these letters may not come off nice and curvy. So the C looks like it's nice and rounded, but sometimes it won't. I can play all day long with this extrude. It's not from the extrude that it's not looking curvy, it's from the text itself, okay? So on the text, there's at the very bottom, it says intermediate points. If I say none, you'll see how this gets all of a sudden blocky. Where the A is right there. Let me turn off the extrude for a second so you can see it. At the bottom of the A, you can see how this is really like chunky like that. If I change this to uniform, it helps smooth that out. If I change it to subdivided, it smooths it out. Each one of these things at the bottom is changing how the text that gets created is adding points to that shape. So as natural, what it's going to do is just wherever it needs more divisions, it's adding it in there, okay? And I can adjust more of those divisions here. And you can see it actually creates some pretty ugly geometry because we have a lot of divisions here and not a lot right here. If I change this to adaptive, that's another similar like one. If I change this to uniform, then it's a uniform layout across the board for it. And you'll see how many points I have going across here all the way around and up. I could again adjust that number. Now, why this is important, if you look at the top of the M here, that looks pretty good. Let me switch it to, it's blocky, but let me switch it to adaptive. So you can see here under adaptive, it's actually distorting that top of the M, where however it's calculating it, there's like points probably on top of each other, it just doesn't know what to do. So by setting it to uniform, that goes away. And then I can kind of crank that number up manually. Nope, there's the problem. I'll back off one step, maybe two steps. Okay? And now that's nice and smooth. So that's why we need to know where to adjust these points, because there's several spots that we may need to tweak those. Okay? All right. So I'm going to delete the text. I'm going to delete the extrude. Okay? The other way to do this is under MoGraph. There's just a MoText. The reason I'm showing both is because sometimes you may need, under Spline, you may need this text for certain effects. Some effects, you will add the spline to it, and you can do different kinds of animations to that piece of text. Here, I'm going to use MoText, and this is basically all of that kind of combined into one. Okay? So if I go to my caps, here's where I can do my fillet cap. Here's where I can do the fillet cap. If I go to my object, I can go to the show 3D UI. I can adjust where the letters are spaced. I can change what this is typed as, MACA. Enter there we go. I can choose the depth. So on the extrude, there was a depth area. I can control the depth here. I can also control the subdivisions. Okay, now this is the subdivisions extruding depth. Down here, that's where I adjust the points. So right now it's on adaptive, so let me set it to natural. Okay, that's good. Let me set it to, let's say adaptive, or not adaptive, uniform. All right, so uniform is giving me some funky results. I can play with these until I get it kind of smoothed out. Okay, and we'll find in this case that uniform is probably not the best one for this one. It's giving me some weird like crinkles there. I don't really care for. So maybe in this case, natural would be the way to go. You have to play with it because each one of your text pieces you bring in, depending on the font, the words, the letters, everything is going to dictate what those look like. Okay. Here's my caps. So again, I made them fillet caps. I can give them some subdivisions. I can also control in here, this is one of the other nice things, how it's rounding. So typically a fillet cap is just taking our square and just rounding it off. So we have basically just this like rounding there. If I change this to linear, let me give this a color so we can see it. And I'm going to go to my reflectance and just pull this stuff down. Go to my color and just give this like a darkish color. There we go. Back to MoText. I'm going to turn off my shading. That didn't help. Alright, so as a fillet type linear, you can see this just goes straight versus convex, which goes like this, versus concave, which goes like that, and so on. So there's a lot of different ways that you can adjust the text here. As you play with each one of those, again, it could introduce different artifacts. So here's the A. It like crossed itself right there. So I may need to play with, let's say, whole inwards. There we go. Now took care of it. Okay. I also may want to click constrain. Nope, not that one. That's good. So everything looks like it's good now. It wasn't a second ago. Like I said, depending on your letter, depending on your font, depending on everything, will dictate the settings you have to play with. So don't be focused on this is what his were, this is what mine need to be. You have to be able to go through and literally just click around until you find what you're looking for. Okay? Typically, if the problem happened when you started playing with the caps, typically it's going to be inside the caps area. If you started playing with stuff over here and it happened, then the problem was probably going to be over there. Not always, but typically. Cool. Now, we'll also notice on this far side that we have effects. All of the effects that we've kind of played with before, like the effector, so we did the random before, a couple of you did the plane that we played with. All of those effects we can still do right on these letters. That's one of the great things about MoGraph, is all of these effects kind of work together. So when we use a cloner, any effect we use there, we could also use on this text. So just to give an example, let's say I go to the effector and I use a plane. Okay? So the way that a plane works is it's just going to take everything and just move it or scale it or rotate it. By default, it just takes the, I go to parameter, it takes the Y position and moves it up 100 centimeters. So let's say that I go to fall off here, because right now it's like everything is on. And I'm going to go to shape and change this to, I guess I'll change it to box. It's easier for you guys to see what that's doing. So the way box works is anything inside the box is affected. So you see the box is over here. It's not affected. It's there. It is affected.
So
right?
Have animation that goes by and
Right, and bumps each one. Right? I could also make the box bigger. There's our handlebars. Oops. There we go. I could also do other stuff. So instead of this just being like moving it up, let's see what else I can play with. So if I go to my effector or parameter, that was just position. So let's say I went to scale, turn this to uniform, turn it to absolute, went to -1. There they are. Right? So now I'm able to make each one of those letters kind of pop in. And then I could also have them rotate. This window is kind of short. Let's get that over.
Wait, is that what they do when they have the shapes come out of other shapes most of the time?
Mm-hmm. Yep, they're just doing this kind of thing where it's just like random rotations and scales and stuff. So now there's the M, A, C, A. Right. All right. Now box is not typically one I use because usually my effects will flow from one side to the other. I don't use this where it's like, here's the logo. I'm going to have it go off screen and then come back on. Typically it's just off screen and then comes on screen. Okay. Or the other way, it's on screen then goes away. So I'm going to go to fall off, and instead of this being box, I'm going to change it to linear. And linear is just this flat area here. You can see the arrow. So typically I rotate this around so that the arrow is facing the direction I'm going to be moving it. Whatever is behind the arrow is affected. Okay, so as I move this over, okay, so what I would do is animate this going backwards. Right? Oops, that's not what I want. I want it to go the other way. Let's go with this. So I'm going to rotate this around. If I can get back to my rotate tool, where'd you go? I'm going to rotate this around this way. There we go. So now when I animate this coming in this way, here goes the M-A-C-A. Cool. Let me also take that Y position and crank that up some more, like 400. There we go. So now it really kind of flies out of the screen. Okay. Now the cool thing about this is that, or the cool thing about Cinema is that everything is still connected. Everything is still live. So if I go back to my original text and I go back to my object, I can choose whatever font I want. So if I choose Romantic, because MAC is a romantic font, or I choose a sans serif, which is just that, or a scripty one, you'll see that all of the effects still are at play. So as I move this, they still all work. So if you had something that you set up for a company and they're like, hey, we love this effect that you did, can you do that for our title? Sure. I go into Cinema, type in their title, there you go. Pretty straightforward. Okay. Now again, I chose a different font. You can see that my new font choice is not playing nice with these fillets. So I'm going to go back to here, back to my MoText. I'm going to go back to my cap and change this. Oops. Yeah, I actually don't want the half circle. I typically will go with convex. It's perfect. Maybe I'll take the radius down. Okay, so it's blocky, but still kind of like rounded around the edges. What else? Maybe constrain. How's that going to work? Sometimes you have to render it out. I can already see an issue, but just to double check, yep. So you can see the A's when I hit constrain did that. Not a big deal. I just unconstrain it. Oops. And then this time I'm going to go back to my object and change the divisions here. So I'll change that to adaptive, and let's see if that fixed it. Yep, that did. Okay, so here they were under natural. You can see they're overlapping. Here it is under adaptive. Nice and smooth. And I can probably make these just a little bit bigger. Yes, and yes. And I also want to make sure my text isn't going through the bottom because that looks weird, so I want to pull this up just a little bit. The C is always like one that's never perfect. There we go. Cool. To render it, make sure everything still looks good. I probably want this to be maybe bold. Go back to my object. I should probably also make sure that this is centered. So I'll say middle. Bold. That's much better. And you can see here, look at the spacing on the MA, and look at the spacing on the AC, and the spacing on the CA. Where's the spacing issue? AC, right? So we click that. Scoot the C closer. And maybe even scoot the A a little bit further away from the M so they're not like overlapping each other. Okay, maybe that one just a hair. Good. Okay, that feels better. Render it out just to double check. Yes. Yep, everything's good there. I check a couple things. One of them I'm checking to make sure that they're rendering out nice and smooth on the curvy letters. I'm not getting any weird colorations on here. Like sometimes you'll see like a black square or a black region where stuff's overlapping maybe. And then I also want to see if stuff's floating. So the A and the M and the other A look like they're floating and the C does not. So oops. If I go to my kerning here, if that's adjusting everything, if I click on just the C, I can adjust just that C's baseline. So I'm just going to scoot it up, and then I'll move the whole word again so it's nice and flat. There we go. Alright, so now the C looks like he's floating a little bit, so then I will just adjust the C's baseline maybe to 10%. Yep, so that feels like everything is now resting on the floor. Good. Okay. Alright, so now this first one is pretty much done. So I'm just going to animate this going from one side to the other. So I started here. These are going to be all 3 seconds, so it's 90 frames. So I'm just going to go to the beginning and set a position X. Go to 90, scoot this over to the other side, position X. So now if I hit play, nothing happens because I clicked on, no, I clicked on the right thing. Oops, I didn't click on the right thing. Because I'm adjusting the wrong thing. That's coordinates I wanted to animate. There we go. And that's position Z. Oh, it is X, yeah. Position X. There we go. So we start there, we go to the end. So now we hit play. Okay. One thing we want to be aware of is that we don't want a whole lot of lead time before the text starts. When we hit play, it should just start falling right away. Okay. And the reason for that is if you look at what we would render out, look how many frames would have nothing in it. Okay, we're looking for something to pop in right here. There it is. So we basically have 40 frames of nothing, so a second in a frame, or a second in 11 frames, and then our stuff would pop in. And then right here at 64, we would have another second of nothing happening, okay?
So it's just 1 second of animation.
1 second of animation, right? So I want to make sure that when I set my start frame, that I'm setting it at an appropriate spot where it's like, okay, this is actually where it's coming in. There we go. Okay. Now the way we can tell where it's coming in is obviously just by looking at it. But where the dots are, where the letter is, once this passes that threshold, that's what's going to start causing it to fall down. Okay. So let's say I start off over here. That's my new start point. And then where it's going to end should be right after it ends. Okay. I'll leave a little bit of room, so right there's where it ends. So I'm going to go right, let's say like that. Okay, so there's a little bit of room there. Now I rewind it and play it. That's much better. Okay, we still have a lot of frames. I don't know why I can move over further. There we go. Reset that, hit play. Good. So now that's going to feel a lot better. We're not wasting our time. We're just getting right into it. Now, let's pretend that we wanted several frames at the beginning or several frames at the end of just whatever it is. Nothing happening or just that text on there. All of that I can do inside After Effects. So there's no point in doing that here and just wasting render time. We're rendering out exactly what we need. If I need to copy frames at the beginning or copy frames at the end, I can do that. Okay? Cool. Alright, so now I'm going to scoot this back over. This here and this here, I'm just going to Alt-G, and I'm going to call this Text Animator 01. I'm going to make a camera, and this is going to be the camera that I render all my stuff through. So I'm going to go to object, I'm going to set my focal length to, let's say, 80. I'm going to click off my camera and just zoom out a bit. Verify that at the beginning of this, yep, there's nothing there. Cool. Okay, so that's good there. Let's render this and see what it looks like. Alright, I like the way that looks. So right now I'm looking at composition. I'm looking at not colors so much or lighting. I'm looking at the left side of my word and the right side of my word and verifying that those two things are equally spaced. I'm also looking at the space above this and the space below it and verifying that I like the amount of space between these two things. If you do it wrong, you may have something like this. Okay, and that's not necessarily wrong, it just feels cramped, right? Because it feels like the text is way at the top and we have nothing on the bottom. So we don't have a nice balance here of our stuff. All the animation of it coming down and falling into place, it's gone. We've missed it all, okay? So I like to have the stuff like this so it's more in the bottom of the screen. So I would see the letter falling down into place, okay? If you need to use like your pinky or your thumb and kind of visualize a space or a ruler, just kind of eyeball, you know, each side, feel free to. All right, so I'm going to adjust my colors on this just so I can get some better coloration. Let me adjust my gradient. I think I just want to soften the center of that more. And then I'm going to go to this color, and I'm going to pick a basically the opposite color. And if I go into this 214, 61, 100, I'm going to go back into this color. Okay, that's the color of the blue. And then I'm just going to subtract 180, which would give me 34. That's the exact opposite of that color. Okay, that's the complete complement. And then I'm going to boost some of the saturation on it just so it pops a little bit more. Okay, now even though I picked orange, it's coming out yellow because our light is just blowing it out. So under my reflectance, if I turn this off, we should get more of an orange color. Nope, that light is just crazy bright. All right. So now I know I need to go into my lighting and just pull that light intensity down, probably on light number 1, which is the bright one. There we go. So that's looking closer to the color I wanted. And still closer. And much better. There we go. I like that. I'm happy with that contrast between the two colors there. Happy enough anyway. I could also give my lighting here a little bit of color. Just a little bit. You don't want to overdo it. And I'll compare before and after. Yeah, just kind of gives a little bit of a tint to these things here. Just darkens them a little bit. Oh, I guess it was better before. All right, so I'm going to take that off. Okay, so I like where the camera is. That's placed perfectly. I'm going to add in another one of those locks or protection tags. So now my camera won't move. So now my animation for this one is that. Now I can just do my regular stuff. I'm going to go to my render settings. I'm going to make this physical. I'm going to add an effect on here. I'm going to add ambient occlusion. This will take it so that our rendering will have just a little bit more ground contact shadows. So you can see it right there. It feels like they're actually touching the floor more than they do here. Okay, we still have our vibrancy. We just have that a little bit crisper at the bottom. You could adjust the coloring here or the maximum ray length there. If this is set to 10, that would most likely lessen the effect of that. So there's the before and after. So you can see now those contact shadows are very crisp where they're placed. And I think I like that even Maybe not fully better, but maybe like at 50 it would be better. Yep. So I think I like that better. So I'm going to stick with that. I'm going to go under physical. I'm going to set this to motion blur, so we get motion blur as it animates in. The the sample quality will be set to high. Output. These will render out at 960 by 540. We'll render all of our frames. And then I will save this to, what was 2510? Titles, renders. And I have to give this a distinct name. We will have 3 separate animations, maybe more if I had more to this, 3 separate animations that will add into this thing. So make sure that each one is named separately. So this will be Sarcona title 01. Oops, don't put 01. 1. There we go. If you put 01, After Effects might get confused and think 01 is part of the sequence. So it'll say 1, 2, 3. Now that's part of the sequence. You type it, it doesn't know. So Sarcona title 1. There we go. Name.number.extension. And we shouldn't need the alpha channel. That should be fine. Okay. So now I'm going to render this out. And then I would let this go. Okay. So the same way that we rendered out our mini room, the same way we rendered out that play one, that screwing around one that we did at the very beginning, is the same way we render this. So it's going to go through and it's going to render out each one of these sequences. Okay. And this is how quick this assignment should go. Each day you come in, you should be able to complete one piece of text animation inside this list. Okay. Just like that. I'm going to hit escape because this is just going to continue, or close this, is just going to continue going. When you're ready for the second one, this stuff is already set up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop this onto a layer. I'll call this text anim 01. I will make sure all the pieces are part of that layer. And then I'm going to duplicate it and then clear off the layer tag. Oops. What's that hotkey? Remove from layer. There we go. Just do that, I guess. Layer, remove from layer. Okay. So now I can hide this one so it's not visible. I have the second one, so I'll just call this 02. And then I'm going to do something different with that one. Okay. So this one I'm not going to use the plane for. This one I'm going to use, I'm going to destroy it. I'm going to have it like fall into pieces. Okay. So I'm going to go under MoGraph with the text selected, and I'm going to say Voronoi fracture. Back to my text. Back to my fracture. Colorize fragments is on. Why aren't you colorizing my fragments on? Oh, sorry. I did not put the text inside it. The text has to be inside the Voronoi. There we go. And now it's broken. So what the Voronoi does is it takes the solid pieces of text and it breaks it all up. Now if I were to go to Effector and I went to Plane, yes sir.
I cannot get these animators to go to text.
Okay, I'll come over there and show it after we're done. Anytime you're doing any of the animators, it has to be like this. Like I have the text selected, and that effector has to be inside that effect group for all or lines or words or whatever it is, or even letters. So for this one, I have the Voronoi fracture that has the plane on it, just like I added before. And so now I should be able to go to linear like I did before. Rotate it like we did before. And then you can see how this animates down as pieces. Okay. Now just like the same settings I had on the other one, I can put onto this one. So I can go into the parameters. I can say, move it up higher. Give it some scale. So -1, -1, -1. Oops. Just uniform and absolute is fine. And then do some rotation on it. So now as it comes in, it's putting it into pieces. Now when it renders this, even though we see the colorful pieces here, it's just a setting. So it'll actually render out our actual color for it. Gorgeous. I still have my high settings on, so that's why it's taking so long. Okay. I can also drop on top of this. So I'm going to go back to my Voronoi. I'm going to go to the effector, and I'm going to add a random on top of it. Okay. This is what it looks like without the random. Let me just animate this plane moving from one side to the other. So I'm going to rewind this to the beginning. Slide this over. Go to the end. Slide this over. Okay, so this is what it looks like perfect, right? Everything's just kind of like coming down in lines, basically, straight across. If I add that random to it, okay, right now it's going to be broken because the random is affecting everything. It's not just affecting what's happening in the plane area. Okay, so I have to also go to the random and go to the fall off and set this one to linear. Oops, I have it backwards, just like I did the other one. There we go. And then I'm going to animate this together. So I'm going to say, okay, at the end, that's where you're going to be. And then at the beginning, you will be way over here with this. So now when this comes in, you can see how we're getting a little bit more randomness to this versus just that. More random, less random. More random, less random. Okay? Now, under the random parameters here, I can do a couple things. I could, again, play with the position. So this is how much randomness is going to be in there. I could play with the random scale of it. I could play with the rotation. On the other one, what it does is it gives everything the same thing. Like every item has the same exact rotation, the same exact scale, the same exact position. So that as it moves it in, it creates this, you know, very flat looking image. Well, now look at this. Now it's like assembling. So if we hit play, you'll see how all these pieces are now just coming together. Okay. Now, what's neat about the way that this Voronoi works is that we can do a couple things. One of them is just like this. It's broken up into tiny pieces. Every face is basically shattered, and that face is coming together. If we look at what this looks like here, with the motion blur on, this will look pretty neat because we should see some of these pieces that are flying in. They should have some nice blurriness to them. I can't zoom in. But you can definitely see a little bit of blurriness on there. Physical, yes. Okay, but let's say I went to the MoText. I went to Object. Sorry, Caps. There it is. And then I said Create Single Object. So let me rewind this. I'll hit Create Single Object, and then I'll hit Play, and we'll see the animation we get from that, just from one button click. Okay, so now instead of everything being broken up into individual faces, it's actually being broken up into chunks. Okay, now let's say I want more chunks or less chunks. We'll get into more of these settings later, but just so you can see, if I go to the Voronoi, which is where all these pieces are being created, I go to Sources, I can click on the points, and then just tell it to generate more points. More points equals more pieces. So let's say 250. So now we have a whole lot of points on there. And now I rewind it and hit play. Now, we obviously notice that at the very end of this, it's not all the way off the screen. Because we have more points, these plane and random just need to be scooted over just a bit more. Sweet. Right, and again, we render it out. We'll see all these pieces that are just kind of like separated, moving together. And what's neat about these, so those planes that we had, we would get some ambient occlusion, but with the chunks, we'll get a lot more ambient occlusion. So this kind of stuff will look extra neat as it's kind of forming and coming together. Okay. Now, the random and plane are all together, like locked in. But let's go to the end of this. I'm going to take the random one, and I'm basically going to scoot it, forward of the plane. So the random should happen first, and then the plane should happen after. So I'm going to actually rewind that. Okay, so right now it's basically being very random, but the randomness goes away once it passes that yellow bar. If I move it to this side of it, it'll be very random as it's coming together. So depending on where even this is, will give you a completely different animation. And that's what's cool about cinema, these kinds of effects, where it's just like move something and then it's a completely different thing. Change a couple parameters, click a different button, and you'll get some very cool stuff happening. I'm going to take these and drop it into Text Animator 2. That way everything is together. And then what I would do is then go into here, go into my save, type in 2. And then I would render this out, and then I would have my second one done. Okay? So you'll do 3 different ones of these. This is how you could do 2 of them. I'll show next class how to do another 1 or 2. I'll show the class after that how to do another 1 or 2. And that's pretty much going to be it for this assignment. This is going to be a quick one, but it's fun because it's like these... We don't have to do a whole lot of work. We typed a word, we made sure it was nicely spaced, and the rest of it is kind of cinema doing the work for us. Okay? So I would render both of those out from the same camera. Everything's locked there. I didn't save a single thing there. I should have done that. Cool. Questions on this yet?
When is due?
It'll be due like in 3 weeks, but we'll be working on it for 2 weeks, and then the other week we'll just be rendering stuff out. I recommend, just like we have an overlap with the last assignment in this one, I recommend as you finish one, just let it render out. Even if it's in the background or if you have it at home, render it out before you go to bed. You may find something happens that you don't want it to happen. Okay? So like I may render this and see 20 pieces flying in from the ground and like, oh, that looks stupid coming up from the ground. So then I'm like, all right, well, how do I fix that? And then I'll fix it and then re-render it out again. Okay? So you may render these several times. Yeah, that looks cool. So we'll have 3 weeks from now it'll be due, but 2 weeks we'll actually be working on this. The next assignment is going to be our product stuff. So that'll be another 3 weeks on that, and then our drone, and then we're pretty much done.
It's okay if we do more than 3.
You can do more than 3. I recommend doing more than 3. I recommend